Hi, welcome to Byte Size Learning with Arts Access North Carolina. Today, we are back and ready to celebrate Disability Pride Month. We are joined by Priya Ray of DIYabled for a talk on art and disability.
Hi, my name is Priya Ray. I'll give an image description of myself. I'm a brown-skinned woman with dark brown hair. I'm wearing a black t-shirt with a graphic of a tiger, and I'm wearing glasses. I am the founder of DIYabled, which is a nonprofit to educate people about disability and why accessibility is so important. And since I am an artist and musician, I find creative ways to do that. So that's what I do. Um, when I was talking to oh my God, Michaelia, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. Um, um, had been thinking a lot about how the influence of disability does not really exist in the art world. And when I say art world, I mean visual art, music, video art, dancing, media representation, all of that wrapped together, because I feel that's all art. And I also feel that art, however, whatever form you express it in, it represents what people are to the world. And if you don't, like, say, know a disabled person or a person of color or someone that's LGBTQ, um, this is how you learn about people and what their experiences are. So I'm guess I'll just go through, like, I've been kind of writing lists of the different mediums, but I'm going to start with visual art. Like, two things I actually have experience with is visual art and music. And so as an artist, before I became disabled, I was a preparator at museums and I hung art. And that's when I learned that the eye level that we hang art at is 57 inches. So where that number came from was 57 inches from the floor is considered eye level for a person. But we don't know who that person is, because if you're shorter, using a wheelchair, or let's say you have a disability where you need to sit, then your eye level is certainly not at 57 inches. So that's like the first, I guess, like, well, I'll call it an ableist uh concept that has existed before we recognized what ableism is, I think. So that's something that you think of galleries and museums, that is the eye level that they choose to hang their art at. Um, so as another way for artists, I feel like disabled artists, like, because I I I don't participate usually in museum and galleries. Um, the way I sell my art is through craft and art fairs, and I honestly haven't been doing that lately because it's really inaccessible. People that host those don't think of disabled artists and how to include them in that space. And so like the amount of work of setting up a table, displaying your art, all of that, I would need a caregiver and an assistant to participate in that. And so that sometimes that's difficult for me to do. So I haven't really been participating lately. Um, the way I've been doing things lately is more online, because of course online is accessible for everyone, and especially for disabled people. And I think that is something we, I mean, I hope that is something that we as a society have learned during the pandemic, of how um, disabled people and all people can be accommodated, through online activity, whether it's selling your art or doing this interview, or however we do things. So I guess like I'm gonna move on to music because I'm also a musician. I play in a band, I play violin and sing. And as soon as I began trying to perform as a wheelchair user, I realized, and I didn't realize this before, it was something I just did not think of before I became disabled, was that stages are really inaccessible. They don't have ramps. The only way to get onto it is by, if you're a non-disabled person, is by climbing onto the stage. But obviously, in a wheelchair, that's not possible. And have the fortunate privilege of having the enough ability to transfer onto the stage. And then when my wheelchair is brought on stage, I can actually transfer back into my wheelchair from the stage. But not everybody can do that. And so then that's when we have to think about what I was recently told, someone told me, called ability privilege. Whereas some disabled people have more ability than others. So that's something I think in the art world we don't really think about. We've come to this conclusion that there's only one way to provide accessibility to disabled people. And I think when you're part of the disability community, you realize that how untrue that is. So, so that's another thing I was thinking about. And what else? Let me see. So, um I let me think. So the music and I'm gonna look at my notes real quick because I wrote all this down so I could remember. Um, oh yeah, for artists, I'm sorry, I'm moving all over the place with this. But as the other thing for visual art and maybe even musicians are art residencies or music residencies. I often don't apply to those because I don't know what the accessibility is like. I would have to bring a caregiver with me. So when you get residencies, the money you get, the space that is provided for you, accessibility is not something they inform you about. So you either have to ask or you just assume that it's not accessible and you just don't apply. And that's, I think, happens more. I think the second or the latter option is really what happens is people just assume it's not accessible. And so yeah, that's the other thing. In workshops, anything like that, that's like for art or music workshops, for disability events, people ask for interpreters or what other accommodations a person may need, but that's not across the board. And I feel like that is something simple as asking what accommodations a person needs for anything, for going to a show, going to an art show, participating in a video chat meeting. I think that needs to be asked because while it is important for disabled people, of course, it's important for every human being because human beings process things differently. And they don't necessarily have a diagnosed disability. It's just some people do need captions. Some people might need an interpreter. So, there are all kinds of ways people process information. So I believe it behooves humanity to ask what accommodations a person needs for any situation. So my big thing is because I do think art is the way, as I mentioned before, art is the way we present ourselves to society. I think media and literature, the uh ableist attitudes that exist in those worlds have been backed up and done for centuries and centuries. This isn't like a modern problem. This is just something that has happened. So if you look at literature like To Kill a Mockingbird, or Of Mice and Men, it's interesting, because I was reading like a lot of people that are disabled people that are represented in those books are people with learning disabilities, essentially, and they're viewed as either unintelligent, um, like some sweet, kind person that has no ill, intentions towards people, or they're considered scary sometimes. So these are the perceptions that have been taught to us for centuries and centuries about what a disabled person is. And it's really, I think, I mean, in 1990, of course, the ADA passed. So I think that's basically, I mean, the 504, from okay, I'm gonna recap that. So I do think when disabled people started speaking out in the 70s, with the 504 sit-in, the IDEA Act, so disabled kids could get educations, and then of course the top of it, the ADA, the American Disabilities Act. I think that's when people started realizing like realizing the concept of how we were representing disabled people in our media. And it's only recently, I mean, I'm going to say maybe in the beginning of this century, where disabled people are portrayed as having their own viewpoint, perspective, and being being a part of the world. um One of the shows that I really enjoyed was the show Special, that was starred a person with cerebral palsy, and I believe he wrote it and acted in it. And I just thought it was a really great representation of a disabled person's lifestyle and their own personal experience, and kind of sharing that with people that may not understand what a disabled person's life is at all. And I think it was really smart because it also included um how even disabled people are ableist towards other disabled people, because they don't understand the idea of ability privilege, whereas you might have more ability than another, and you're only looking at it from that perspective rather than the whole community itself, and how, how everybody has different kinds of ability. So, and that actually motivated me during the pandemic to make a movie that I call Disability on the Spectrum, which oh, let me back up a second. So during the pandemic was the first time I was actually able to meet other disabled people. And that's when it opened my eyes to how the online community that's like our neighborhood. That's the disability neighborhood, where we all gather together online and be able to discuss things that of how we're left out of things, or how we can make things better, or whatever we do as disabled people. So that experience then motivated me to make my own documentary called Disability on the Spectrum. And the reason I decided to make that was because I realized, if you know one disabled person, then you think that all disabled people are like that one disabled person, or if you don't know any disabled people, then your idea of what disability is going to come from these movies or these books that you read. And it's not, it's wrong. It's a lie, essentially. So I decided to I got 3 people with cerebral palsy and 2 people with spinal cord injury, myself and another gentleman, and I just, created this DIY, which is what I do, DIY, documentary, where I showed the ability and had people talk about what they can or can't do, and in the end, it was really great because my purpose was just to show the different abilities people had, even though they had the same disability, but I don't know, people that watched the movie were loved it so much because the people everybody had their own personality, and so then you weren't looking at the disability, you were looking at the people. You weren't think being like, "Oh, I feel so sorry for this person. They're disabled." Instead it just showed that they have a disability and they do other things. It's just one part of their identity. And so I was really happy with that film that when that film came out. So going back to like a show like Special, where it was great because the lead character was disabled, but what I would like to see in the media is like to have like a show, something like Friends, which is an ensemble of people, and one or maybe two of the people happen to be disabled, and create a plot where it's not really about focusing on the person being disabled or the non-disabled friend coming to their rescue. Like, why not have the disabled people help the non-disabled person with something they can't, overcome in life? So, that's really like what I would like to see as far as media representation. And, I think we're getting there because, last year, I think it was last year, Coda got nominated for, won awards, and the actor that played the father, who was deaf, got, a Best Supporting Actor award, which I thought was fantastic. And Crip Camp also got nominated. So I think we are slowly moving in that direction. Um, but the way we do that is by continuing to do these things, what we do. I'm doing a Disability Pride art show this year. I also am creating a zine of disabled writers. And I just think the more we put out there disabled people doing what everybody else does, then I think we start breaking those ableist views of humanity. Really, no, I mean, disabled people, I think, are going to be the leaders in breaking these ideas of ableism because we suffer more from that type of bigotry than others, I believe. So yeah, so that's like my thing. And then, movies like, experimental movies. There's like, these experimental movies that do strobing effects and things like that, that a lot of we're kind of learning like those things are not accessible. And so what do we do? Like, how do we change that? And I guess I think my way of changing that is just to keep pushing and telling people about it.
Well, thank you so much for all of your amazing insight. It was great listening to all these different ways that the art is inaccessible but can be made more accessible. We have a few questions for you if you would like to answer.
Oh yeah.
Awesome. I guess first is how did you start your Instagram page, DIYabled? What inspired you to create that platform?
Well, I I am not a social media person. Like when it all first started, I was just like, "Oh, this is kind of boring to me." And then a friend of mine, and it was before I had started DIYabled. I'm a photographer, so a friend of mine was like begging me to get on Instagram. And I was like, "All right." And so, being a more visually motivated person, that just rings to my brain better. I got hooked on Instagram, but it was just more my own personal page, and it was before I'd started DIYabled. And then The reason I started DIYabled was because I am in a band, and I decided I wanted to play music in the way I did before was through the DIY community. And for those of people that don't know what that means, let me explain real quickly. So DIY is a way of musicians and artists to be able to express and play their music or show their art, but not necessarily waiting for a money sponsored, a corporation or a gallery or something to fund them being able to do it. And it's really through a community that happens. And so when I became disabled, I felt being part of the DIY community before I became disabled really prepared me for being disabled in in the world, because community is how we're gonna be able to do things. So I focus on community a lot, because while the ADA is there, it is a law, and it's always going to be there in our back pocket to pull out and say, hey, there's this law. But I don't know, we need the community to like understand that you need to include disabled people to make your communities richer. So that is how I started. I just started going and talking to the DIY communities that I knew already, and started speaking up about disability and how we aren't really inclusive, even though the community has worked to be inclusive to people of color, LGBTQ people, women, and other, marginalized groups, but never really disability. So I kind of thought, well, that's wrong, because if anybody needs a community like that, it would be disabled people. So then I started speaking out, and then that's when I started. Since I was already on Instagram, I'm like, well, I guess I'll start a DIYabled Instagram. And I kind of try to keep my personal stuff and the DIYabled a little separate, but then it's hard because, of course, dis that is part of who I am. I am a
Yeah.
disabled person. So that would be like, I'm not going to talk about being a woman or being Indian, or, so I can't always keep that separate. And so, sometimes it overlaps, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. Community is such a strong part of being disabled and making the disabled experience easier on us all. What are some of your tips for other disabled artists in self-advocating in these different kinds of art spaces?
Um, oh gosh, that it is a good question. And of course I have lots of answers. I'm just processing it all in my
Yeah,
head. Um, I think speaking up, if you are a disabled artist and there are galleries and things that are not accessible, you need to tell them. And you will get pushback, because some people get really defensive. But my advice is, don't push back with the defensiveness and anger they are. Just explain to them like, hey, I am an artist. And your space isn't accessible. And I've even approached local galleries about, when they're posting about the shows, I tell them they should include image descriptions, and I'm very nice about it. And I just, through the DIYable Instagram, because I know a lot of those local places follow me and look at what I say, I talk about, that's the great thing about social media, is that you can kind of be angry at someone to release that anger at that one specific person. But there's like so many other people that are like that one specific person you're angry at. So it's a good way to like kind of get that frustration and anger out, and talk about like how you've been not included in a community. And the way I do it, I just make it more broad in general. I don't really talk about the
yeah,
specific situation, but I'm just like, when we don't do this, this is what happens. You are not being inclusive. So that's my advice to disabled artists, is speak up constantly. Like, if you get shows, I have a disabled friend who got a show at a gallery, and we kind of got together because like she had sent me the description of this gallery. She was having a show, and they were like, we have this staircase that leads to this gallery and that goes down to that gallery. And it was like, and as a disabled person, I'm reading, disabled wheelchair user, I'm reading this and I'm like, oh my God, this sounds like a nightmare, this gallery to me. It doesn't sound like I would be able to access anything. And then one of the things she was showing me was the accessible entrance was through an elevator that was like in the back of the gallery. But when you get out of the elevator, like what you see is this like storage room, and beyond the storage room, the gallery's behind the storage room. And I said, and that's not right, because if you're
Yeah.
disabled, shouldn't you have the immersive experience of what a gallery is? Like when you're a non-disabled person, you walk into the gallery and you're just immersed by the art and the creativity and what you're seeing. Whereas you're a disabled person, you have to like go into a storage room and then like kind of, so you lose that immersive experience that non-disabled people have in galleries. So a lot of galleries do that kind of thing. So yeah, I just think if you're an artist, you get a show, you know, talk about that, say this is
Yeah.
wrong, the way you've set this up is not inclusive to disabled people, and let them know. And my friend who's the artist was actually setting up the art from the elevator, like that would be the focal point, would be coming from the elevator instead of the entrance to that gallery from the other side. So which I thought was good. And that's what I was telling you. I was like, flip that around. Make it more, accessible in that way, So
Yeah.
that's what I suggest to disabled artists. It's like, if you get a show, you're not getting a show, don't hold back, because people should include you. It's 33 years since the ADA has passed. And this is time for people to like understand that they need to include disabled people can do anything, from being scientists to artists to cooks, so it's like everybody needs to be included.
Absolutely. And then our last question was, when we're creating art, what are some ways that we can keep access in mind in the works that we're creating?
That's another good question. So I don't know. I know a lot of disabled people make art based on their own experience. And one of the things I wanted to include, like I went to art school before I was disabled in my 20s. And I remember a professor saying, kind of looking down upon people that made art for therapy, and like was like, oh, that's not real art. And I was young and I didn't really think about it, but now I do think about it, because one of the things I read something that said impairment is oh God, I wrote it down. Let me see, because I knew I'd forget it. Let me see. Oh yeah, that impairment is oh God, let me remember. I'm gonna find this. I'm sorry. Oh yeah, okay, there it is. So yeah, I read somewhere where impairment creates a creative force, actually. So this idea of how art shouldn't be like the therapy of art, like people that create art for therapeutic reasons because they have a mental disability, and making art just keeps their minds stable, doesn't mean their art isn't good. It just means that's what they do. And I think if we kind of think about all the famous artists we've seen over time, I don't know, I feel like they've had disabilities. It's just something we've never really talked about. We've just talked about what other things influence their art, but we never were like, we feel they might have had bipolar or whatever the mental disability is. We don't talk about it in that way. And some of the best artists and musicians I've met in my life have definitely had mental disabilities and create the most amazing art and music. And I think that's because when you do have an impairment, you have to figure out how to live in a world that does not accommodate your impairment, and you have to get creative with it. So then when you're making art, writing, doing any of these things, you're doing it from a different perspective than a person that doesn't live with an impairment. So that's kind of my feelings about that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure being able to listen to you speak. And yeah,
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I love Arts Access, and I love the work y'all are doing, and I think it's amazing. So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of it.
of course.